Welcome to another episode of the brand called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very senior and accomplished leader from Bangalore, India, Dr. Madana Kumar, PhD. Madana, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sush. It's great to be part of this show. I am humbled that
Thank you.
you have invited me to be part of your show.
Thank you. Dr. Kumar is a servant leadership evangelist, and he's the co-founder of Leadyne. His passion is in transforming organizations by evangelizing servant leadership. And given the amazing work that he has been doing, understandably, he has received several national and international laurels. So, Madna, my first question to you is tell me about your journey.
Yeah, excellent. So I'm actually interestingly, I'm actually an engineer by qualification, and
Mhm.
after several years of engineering work, I sort of stumbled onto a leadership development program at IBM, and I found that what it offers is an opportunity to impact a lot more people than what I would actually be able to impact in an operational, business job.
Right.
And so I decided to do a crazy thing of quitting, a pretty lucrative career,
Hmm.
and decided to, shift focus into a role that, that gives me an opportunity to touch multiple lives.
Right.
So, and that's how I ended up in this particular,
Amazing.
field of leadership development.
Fantastic.
I have,
And
uh,
and how would you define servant leadership?
yeah, I have actually, of course, my own definition of servant leadership, and the definition that I have arrived at is like this, Ashutosh. I define a servant leader as someone who invests in the life of another person to the
Hmm.
extent that the other person becomes better, bigger, wiser, richer, healthier, wealthier, happier, more famous than the leader
Mm,
himself or herself. Right. I think that's the key, of the definition of servant leadership. Right.
mm,
Yeah.
mm. And when I was preparing for my conversation with you, I was also fascinated that you selected servant leadership as the topic for your doctoral dissertation.
Yeah.
What was the reason for you to focus from the corporate world to
Yeah.
such an extreme position of even doing a PhD in servant leadership?
Yes. Yeah, that's an interesting story, actually. As I told you, I shifted my job from being a operations business leader into a development, individual contributor. Actually, when I shifted into an individual contributor role, with
Mm,
which everybody said it's a foolish move because I was stepping down from what is called as an upline manager into an individual contributor role. And so
right.
it's not a great move at that time, but I was passionate about it. And so I went ahead and did that. And incidentally, that is also the time when I started studying the Bible. Right. And so when I was, I was going through the leadership development, preparations for IBM, and I was
Mm,
reading the Bible, and I could see a lot of, similarities between, the concepts that is being talked about and the concepts that is being talked about in the Bible. And then, I discovered the concept of servanthood and servant leadership in the Bible, and that kindled a desire for me to, learn more.
mm,
Now, you have a full-time job, you have a family, and you have a desire to study. That desire remains in paper, right? You
mm.
know that. So
Correct.
I did another crazy thing. I went ahead and decided to enroll in a PhD program so that I will create an external pressure on myself to
Mm,
study this topic more.
okay.
So that's the reason why
Wow.
so actually, the topic was already selected, and I wanted to study it more. And the PhD was just my own way of creating an external pressure on myself to study it. So
Oh,
that's why I went ahead and registered.
wonderful. And
Um, you
it's
know,
so
on a
inspiring for
light
our
on a
viewers and
light
listeners,
yeah on a lighter note, that's the reason why my wife calls my PhD as permanent head damage. So she said I did a crazy thing by doing that. Yeah.
Well said. My next question, Madha, is what are some common misconceptions you have encountered about servant leadership in the corporate world?
Yeah, I have researched that topic, and interestingly, it is not just one. I have actually unearthed almost about 26 myths that I normally find
Mm.
in organizations. But the most common ones, as those are that it is the whole negative connotation associated with the word servant itself, right? All said and done, none of us wake up by saying, "Hey, look, I want to be a servant today." And and then when I ask you, okay, who comes to your mind when you think about a servant? It's not the leaders who come in. It's
Correct.
always the maid or the people who are lower in the society that comes in your mind. So it has got a negative connotation, and so because of that, the term itself has got an oxymoronic nature,
Mm.
a term that contradicts in itself. So
Yeah.
people really wonder how you can be a servant and a leader at the same time. So I think one of the first myths is that you cannot lead by serving, right? It's an oxymoron. It just cannot happen,
Mm.
right? So
Mm.
that's the first myth. And then, of course, associated with it is several others that know that it is a soft leadership
Yeah.
philosophy. It will not produce results. Servant leaders will not be able to handle poor performers. Servant leaders don't, focus on organizational results. Servant leadership is patriarchal. So there are several other misnom, the myths that surround this particular, concept.
Mm. But at the same time, you spoke about some people being thinking about that it's an oxymoron. But when you're in large organizations, how can leaders maintain a balance
Yeah.
between serving employees and maintaining authority in decision making?
Yeah. So I typically go by, what we call as an inverted pyramid concept, right? So I always say that, look, the bird servant leadership has got two parts, right? There's a servant part and then there's a leader part. And actually the leader part comes first. So there is a role for a leader where the leader sits at the top of a organizational pyramid,
Right.
decides the vision, the mission, the goals, the values, and, the objectives of the organization. But during the implementation, the leader doesn't still continue to sit at the top, shouting out orders and monitoring everything, breathing down the necks of the people, etc. But instead, what the servant leader does is they invert the pyramid. They invert the pyramid, and the leader steps down and say that, okay, now that I have set you the vision, mission, values, and goals, you go and implement it. You are responsible for implementing it. And hey, I'm not going anywhere. I am available at the bottom of the pyramid,
Mm.
and I am available to you as a resource to you, and I am a servant to you, right? So this shift from the leader role to a servant role can be made can be made very intuitively and very seamlessly if
Mm.
one understands the concepts of this thing. I mean, for example, to invert the pyramid, you need to empower the others, right? You can't just invert the pyramid without empowering the others. So there are several other things that you need to do to make that inverted pyramid. But the
Mm.
concept is this, that you are responsible as a leader to set the vision, mission, values, goals, objectives of the organization. But after that, you leave the implementation to the team and
Mm.
you be available as a resource if people need your help.
Mm. Well said. Madhan, there's often a lot of discussion on emotional intelligence of leaders. My question is, what role does emotional intelligence play in practicing and promoting servant leadership?
It's a very, very important role. And
Mm.
I would actually, I actually um, bring this emotional intelligence to a higher level when we talk about servant leadership. So one of the, I have developed a framework where there are 7 behaviors that I advocate for servant leaders. And one of those behaviors is called emotional healing.
Mhm.
And this is actually one level above the emotional intelligence concept that we talk about. This is about how do we use our emotional intelligence to heal relationships between each other, to heal the problem, the frustrations, the hurts and the conflicts that we have within the organization and things like that. So we help leaders develop this habit of emotional healing by the concepts of forgiveness, by the concepts of apologizing, by the concepts of grace, for example, right? The divine grace that people talk about and say, okay, how do we? So these are some of those unusual topics that we
Mm.
talk about
Correct.
in servant leadership when we implement servant leadership. So
Mm.
yes, understanding the emotional aspects of an issue of a person is very, very important
Mm.
in implementing servant leadership.
Mm. Great response. And can servant leadership be integrated with other leadership styles such as transformational or situational leadership?
Yes, it can be. Now, that's why I always call servant leadership as a philosophy. It is not a style by itself, right?
Mm.
So it is a philosophy, and normally the leaders can use a mix of several other styles to, implement that philosophy. The philosophy is very simple. The philosophy is to approach people as human beings
Right.
and not as human resources.
Mm.
You understand my
Yep.
point, right? So we all have a tendency of, approaching people as resources, right? Even though we call it as human resources, but the term resources means something to be used for producing results, right? Simple. So we have to shift from that mindset. So you can use transformational leadership style. You can use
Mm.
situational leadership style, as long as your motive or your way of looking at people is not as mere resources, but
Mm.
as whole human beings. And
Mm.
then you use those, approaches to, bring them up, to inspire them, to motivate them, to, develop them, invest in them and things like that. They're absolutely fine. Actually, the proponent of situational leadership, Ken Blanchard, he is one of my gurus, and he is one of the strongest advocates of servant leadership. And he
Mm.
says, look, situational leadership is nothing but servant leadership in action, right? So
Right.
he,
Right.
I mean, he's also the proponent of situational leadership and servant leadership. So you
Okay.
can already
Yeah.
actually see
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
integration
Well
happening
said.
there.
Well said. And I'm sure you've worked with many leaders who have, traditionally followed the top-down approach. What strategies do you recommend to convince traditional top-down leaders to adopt servant leadership mindset?
Yeah. Interesting question. The fact of the matter is that we cannot change somebody just by,
Correct.
talking to them and, unless the person wants to change. So my philosophy has always been what I call as the stealth mode of change.
Hmm.
So typically what we do is to implement this change at the mid-level, right?
Hmm.
And choosing one or two receptive leaders, and
Hmm.
then use that success stories
Hmm.
to convince the others about look
Right.
its benefit and things like that. Then it becomes a like what we call the starfish this the starfish method, right? So it becomes a really it grows like that, and that's literally how in the large organization UST that I am involved with, we have grown it. We have introduced it at the mid-level, and then through word of mouth and through the success stories being shared, people have come to know that it is good, and so more and more people join this thing. And so sometimes the leaders do not have a choice but to accept it, right? Saying that, okay, look, what I need is research, and
Hmm.
now these teams are giving me research and more, right? So
Hmm.
why wouldn't I want to do that? Of course,
Hmm.
so that would be the best way. Of course, we can talk to them about the problems that they are likely to face if they continue the traditional command and control leadership style,
Right.
and the advantages that they can benefit if they convert that into a more human-centric leadership philosophy. We can share case studies with them and things like that. So all those we can do, but my experience shows that the best thing is to show results within their organizations itself. So just give me one team within an organization where the leader doesn't believe, and I can change that
Amazing.
leader's mind.
Amazing. Amazing. And what role does trust play in servant leadership, and how can leaders build trust within their teams?
Huge. Trust is a huge factor, because you see, servant leadership is all about celebrating significance. So that's a
Mm.
bit different from celebrating success, right?
Mm.
Now, there's nothing wrong with success. Success is not a
Yeah.
bad word, but
Yeah.
the problem with celebrating success is typically success. The mindset of success sometimes becomes self-focused, right? So
Mm.
you add value to yourself. You achieve great things, you achieve wealth, health, fame, whatever it is, knowledge, you get a PhD, whatever, right?
Mm.
But significance is when you you achieve things, but with the explicit motive of adding value to others, right?
Right.
So whatever you do, you have to ask that question. Look, if I'm getting a PhD, how will it add value to others? If I'm, getting something, done, or chasing a business or whatever it is, how is it going to add value to others? And if we are able to shift this from that to this, the whole, whole culture of competition within the organization will go away, and
Mm.
the culture of collaboration comes into picture. Now, of course, you got to add to that what I talked about right earlier, the culture of forgiveness, right, where we know that mistakes will be made, we learn from mistakes and move on. The culture of grace, but where people don't just go and ask, okay, look, does this person deserve it? But go beyond that and say, okay, even if this person is not deserving, can I show grace in that on that person and
Mm.
still invest in that person and things like that? So with those type of changes, trust is the biggest thing that gets built within a team,
Correct.
and the teams work seamlessly and without conflicts. Without unhealthy conflicts, I should say. Healthy
Mm.
conflicts are always welcome,
Mm.
but without unhealthy conflicts and things like that
Well
in
said.
an organization setup.
Well said. Well said. But the other aspect I wanted to get your perspective on is that in today's world where technology has become so important, where different forms of work have started to come in, remote work, hybrid work, using different types of artificial intelligence technologies. How do you see servant leadership evolving?
Yeah. You know, my research very clearly shows that the relevance of servant leadership is only going to increase with the onset of Gen AI, right?
Right.
Now, you look at Gen AI and look at everything that is happening within Gen AI, you will
Mm.
realize one thing, whether you talk about Gen AI, whether you talk about Industry 5.0 or whatever it is, you will realize one thing, that the need for our approaches and our processes to be more and more human-centric is
Right.
only increasing. Right.
Mm.
And how do we do that? How do we do that? How do we remove the fear that is coming because of the Gen AI implementation? How do we make sure that people are not suspicious of each other and things like that?
Mm.
The only solution is to implement
Mm.
human-centric solutions, and that applies to leadership itself and
Mm.
leadership also. And the best human-centric solution to leadership is servant leadership, where
Mm.
you invest in a person, you make them better, bigger, wiser, richer, healthier, wealthier, knowing that if I invest in a person, that person will, help me achieve my results. So,
Right.
so typically, in a future world where technology is going to be more and more, influential, I believe servant leadership will become more and more relevant, because
Mm.
that's the only way to keep people together, to keep people contributing, things like that. You
Yes.
also know that, the what technology provides is a better choice for people, employees,
Mm.
right? Employees of our generation probably didn't have that much choice of, shifting jobs and things like that. But today's generation has got plenty of choices, and they don't have to stay with you
Mm.
if they don't choose to. How do you make them stay with you?
Yeah.
How do you make them choose to stay with you? Servant leadership is the answer.
Mm.
Right? And again, people who are great in technology, who know technology, they know that they can contribute, right?
Mm.
Why would they want to work for a toxic boss, or a boss who, only is interested in command and control? But
Mm.
they would rather work for a boss or a leader who would give them the freedom and say that, okay, look, you know your job, go ahead and do it,
Mm.
and come to me only if you need my help, right?
Mm.
And that's servant leadership. So
Right.
there are several arguments
Yeah.
for,
Yeah.
servant leadership to be the most the most appropriate leadership philosophy in the age of Gen AI.
Amazing. Amazing. And the other perspective I wanted to seek from you was, how does servant leadership align with what has now become the buzzword globally, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, even though in India we've had it in our scriptures for thousands of years?
Yeah. Interesting. Yes. Again, one of the, as I said, one of the basic core foundations of servant leadership is to be looking at people,
Mm.
as human being, right?
Right.
and not just looking at them as about how will they benefit me, what is in it for me if I look at them and things like that. And that's the whole bottom line of diversity and inclusion, isn't it?
Correct.
The moment you look at people, and and if you really wanted to become spiritual, you can even say that, look at people as God looks at them. God looks at them as objects of his unconditional love, isn't it?
Correct.
God doesn't look at people as resources to be used for, attaining something, right? So even in a spiritual way, people are to be looked at it as individuals, as people. And so that when you look at people like that, diversity and inclusion will automatically happen. Automatically happen. So it's actually very, it's one of the servant leadership will act as one of the biggest enablers of diversity and inclusion, in the workplace and in other places.
Amazing. So, Madana, I have time for two more questions. How can one handle a situation where servant leadership might be misinterpreted as a weakness or indecision by others?
Yeah. Yeah, it can certainly happen. I mean, embracing servant leadership is not without its risk. There is a risk in embracing servant leadership. Becoming a servant leader is not going to be easy, right? People are going to look at you, and people are going to probably, take advantage of you and things like that. And I always say that, look, servant leadership is not for the weak-hearted. Servant leadership is for people who are courageous, because you are getting into it knowing that there is a likelihood of it being misinterpreted, it being misunderstood, and you being misused and all that stuff. But what I say is, it is the ultimate results are worth it, right? So the first answer to your question is that yes, you got to first step in knowing that there will be people who misinterpret. There will be people who misunderstand. There will be people even who will misuse that philosophy, right? But my advice to them is stick on to that. Stick on to that, and in the long run, it will turn around. And the way it will turn around in the long run is, I always believe that it has to be balanced with confidence, right? So, for example, humility and confidence, right? If you have humility but don't have confidence, you become indecisive, right? But and if you have confidence but don't have humility, you become arrogant.
Right.
Right? And neither of them are good. So the best way to do this is to combine high humility with high confidence. And when you have that high combination, when you have that great combination, you go there knowing that you're secure, you're confident, and you're humble. Right? And that is what servant leadership does. So servant leadership makes you a person who is humble, but at the same time who is very confident of what he or she can do, or what he or she can achieve, and things like that. And so that combination will, help you sail through these misinterpretations.
Very interesting. And my last question to you, can you share an example of an organization where servant leadership transformed not only company culture, but also bottom line?
Yeah. Of course, I can take several global examples. The
Absolutely. And if you
usual
don't want
ones.
to give names, just you can give
Yeah, no, I can give names, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, we can always look at, the companies like Chick-fil-A or Southwest Airlines, or to that matter, Google. We can take the example of Tata Group for that matter, who embrace this philosophy to quite an extent, and things like that. So there are several organizations, but let me give you an example of a company that I am associated with very deeply. And this is a company called UST. Now, UST is 25 years old, actually. This year, we celebrated our 25th, anniversary. And it has grown from, 14 people to a team of about 33,000 operating in 33 different countries and things like that. And 2018, this company decided to implement, use servant leadership as an officially, their leadership philosophy. And since 2018, we have doubled our revenue.
Wow.
Doubled. Okay, within that 5 years, within the 5.5 years, we have doubled our revenue. But while doubling our revenue, we've also become the UST has also become the darling of the of the employer branding, right? So you look at the best places to work, UST is there. You look at the top employer institute, UST is there, not just here, but across the world. And in Asia and in US, they have even given what is called as a blue badge, which shows that more than 4 or 5 countries in that continent, are part of the top this thing. Look at Glassdoor, right? We have a study which shows Glassdoor, our reviews, higher than some of the big four competitors whom we know about, right? So there are several such accolades coming from outside. Of course, we have won several awards, Brandon Hall, and you already referred to some of them, right? Brandon Hall and ATD and stuff like that. So while doubling the revenue, the company has also become darling of the employers, and the employer brand of the organization has gone. This is actually becoming a place where people want to love to work for, and that is certainly a great this thing. And it's becoming a culture. Actually, the Top Employer Institute, which does an audit every year, they found that the implementation of servant leadership has significantly impacted the cultural change within the organization, and that has resulted, obviously, that is obviously not directly, but it has definitely helped the organization's growth.
Amazing, amazing. And on that note, Madana, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me about your journey. I think we covered a lot of amazing ground on servant leadership. I've heard a lot about it, but today I learned many, many new things about servant leadership. We spoke about some of the common misconceptions. We spoke about how emotional intelligence is a critical factor. We spoke about how trust is important. We also were kind enough to talk to me about how transformational, situational leadership is not just different, but they all seem to be working together with servant leadership. We spoke about technology on servant leadership, and we also covered a lot of ground on how diversity, equity, inclusion can really be supported in today's world through servant leadership. Thank you so much for speaking to me about this incredible topic of servant leadership, and all the very best to you.
Thank you very much, Ashutosh. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.